Welcome back, everybody. It's great to have you here, and I want to take full advantage of the time that we have today. So let's turn the floor straight over to Dr. Yohuru Williams. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Good to see everybody again. And let me share my screen here. So part two, we had such a good conversation last time, and I feel like I talked the whole time. So I'm going to try to leave more time for us to have conversation today. But I would say that if something has really moved you and you want to jump in, please feel free to do so, because I have a lot that I'm going to try to throw at you today, but there's a lot that I actually want to share. So we're on part two. And I told you in part two, I was going to tell you about this thing called the Lewis Doctrine, which I really took from that phenomenal letter written by John Lewis to the American people last summer that appeared in the New York Times, and which was one of your readings. And what I loved about John Lewis, and I want to talk about this, is that I think he gave a gift to social studies educators and to history teachers. I think he handed us the most powerful teaching tool that I've seen out of the context of teaching in a long time. And that was this incredible statement that he made. It began with him providing both a challenge and a charge to us as educators and as Americans. And I think implicit in that is a great way to think about how we can use the preamble to teach civil rights and how we can recast the teaching of civil rights in our classrooms. And it also will dovetail nicely with our conversation last week about teaching by proxy and commenting by proximity. But what John Lewis said in the beginning there, and as I mentioned last week, I had an opportunity to work with him, and it was singularly one of the best experiences in my life, getting to know him and having an opportunity to work on Civics for All with he and Andrew Iden in New York. But John Lewis wrote in this piece, "While my time here has come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me." I often thought if I were teaching last semester, I would have begun my course with this. Because I think what John Lewis does in a very powerful way is emphasizes the fact of history as unfinished business, as our desire to think about this as a progress continuum as being messy and requiring all of us to make some meaningful contribution to what it means to be a citizen. And I love that because he spends a lot of time talking about what the responsibilities of government are. He spent his life in government, but he's also talking about being inspired and what individuals can do. He says, "You fill me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story." So what Congressman John Lewis has just done is draft all of my students into history, giving them a reason to think that what we're going to discuss for the next year is really, really important and really, really pertinent. And he says, when you use your power to make a difference in our society. On so many levels, I'm just there, and I want to begin with this. But he goes one step further and he says this. He says, "When historians pick up their pens to write the history of the 21st century, let them say it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war." I want to use John Lewis now to talk about the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. John Lewis in a contemporary context just handed me an opportunity to make relevant and make real so much of what I talk about that has lost value for young people in the graying images of photos in textbooks or in documents that we read. And he does something else that I think is really great here. He says, "So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters. Let the spirit of peace and power and everlasting love be your guide." Great. But what he offers for us, and what I think is great, is this charge. And in this charge is what I like to call the Lewis Doctrine. And that's going to guide our conversation today. What John Lewis wrote is this: ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America. Let me just deal with that for a second. Because he's saying ordinary people, and I love then thinking about all the stories that we talk about in our classrooms, where it's ordinary people who are the drivers of that conversation. Elizabeth Jennings in New York City in 1854, Rosa Parks in 1955, right? And the question is, what helps them develop that extraordinary vision? I'll share that with you in just a few minutes, but I think this is powerful. Everybody likes to quote the part about good trouble, necessary trouble, but look at where he goes next. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. Now, I'm watching what's taking place in Georgia right now. Teach by proxy, comment by proximity. And John Lewis handed me the blueprint to teach this year, to comment by virtue of his experience in Selma in 1965, through the vehicle of looking at the civil rights movement as a litmus test on where we are and where we've been with regard to key issues related to voting, related to housing, related to justice. And what's really powerful about this is that he says, the vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. My man's teaching civics. And I love this on so many levels too, because keep in mind that as we were celebrating Georgia, we were talking about Stacey Abrams, we were talking about voter disfranchisement, we were talking about efforts to overcome all of that. It is John Lewis who last summer put this in a broader context for young people in order to inspire action when he said, and I quote, "You must use it, the right to vote, because it is not guaranteed you can lose it." John Lewis just imbued my history classroom with a sense for action and why we need to take immediate, or how young people could take action, and how that action doesn't only manifest itself in terms of showing up at protests with signs that read Black Lives Matter. Don't get me wrong here, because I don't mean that as a critique at all. I mean that in the sense that I assume all of you are receiving it, that John Lewis is laying out a blueprint for action that is multifaceted, that involves more than just protest. But look at what he says you can do to develop this extraordinary vision. So the question is, how do you develop extraordinary vision? Lewis continues, "You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time." Thank you, Congressman. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that's why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. I love this. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Again, I think I shared this with you last week, but I was on ABC News Australia, and I think I told you the story about the Indigenous activists that reached out afterward and said, "Thank you for coming and talking about George Floyd on Australian television, but we want you to know that 432 Indigenous people have died in police custody in Australia since 2001, the most recent being a gentleman who died on Christmas Eve, 2019. His last words were, 'I can't breathe. Your struggle is our struggle. The next time they have you on, please mention us and let us know that you know that we're dealing with a similar phenomena as you.'" What I think is really powerful about this is that he concludes that together you can redeem the soul of America, not including himself, obviously, because he's gone, but certainly it played his role. What do I love about this? What I love about this is that I think we can tease this out into a Lewis doctrine that becomes a powerful invitation to interrogate the ways in which young people can not only study history, but they can apply civics and apply history. What is this Lewis doctrine? It's these four tenets. Number one, ordinary people make history both individually and collectively. What are you talking about, Willis? Take a look at the image there of John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's one of my favorite images of John Lewis because I like to tell young people when we look at this image together, John Lewis, we know, and we kind of focus on him, but he's in a sea of other people, all of whom by the expressions on their faces have all made decisions to be there on that day. If it's just John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, then we don't call it the Selma March to Montgomery. We might call it the Meredith March Against Fear, where it's one person. But every individual on that bridge that day made a choice to be there because they believed it was the right thing to do to march for in support of voting rights. And so they're there collectively as a body, but I also love the fact that you get the sense that they had to make those individual choices. It reinforces this idea of agency in history. It helps young people to recognize that historical actors make decisions and that those decisions have consequences and that they could do those decisions in concert with others, but those decisions are ultimately the responsibility of the individual to make. On so many ways, it's such a powerful lesson for our contemporary moment. Secondly, Lewis says, we need to study history not simply to understand the past. That's what kids most often get told, but as a conduit for navigating the present and imagining the future. That's powerful. Because he really invited us to reimagine the future when he said, you can redeem this. It's a lot of weight, but again, I would love to have been there in September with my young people. I normally, I think I told you this last week, began the year, even if I'm teaching college students, I put the preamble up on the wall and I go, these are the things that we're going to navigate, you know, over the course of the semester. These are the questions that we're going to interrogate. We the people, who are the people? When did they become the people? What does it mean, a more perfect union, right? What do we mean by But John Lewis would have been my anchor this year, because in this process of imagining, it invites me to invite them to reflect on what needs to change and how can we work toward the process of perfecting or reimagining or deepening our democracy. Number 3, studying the same bullet point. Studying the past is one way, he argues, we can develop that extraordinary vision he talks about. I love this because John Lewis basically just told my young people that the way they can become John Lewis-like, the way that they can develop that extraordinary vision to change the world, is by studying what we teach. Number 3, struggle is constant and inevitable, but the lessons of the past can help us respond. And number 4, we have to develop a global perspective. So often people go, what about, you know, we teach US history and so on and so forth. He just invited our literature, our global history courses, everything in to work in concert to help young people to understand that the lessons that we can apply from what happens in other corners of the globe that we study can be applicable to our experience here. So Yohuru, why do you think this is so great? I think this is great because you can have fun with John Lewis's timeline, and you can tell a powerful story and use that narrative in a way to teach the civil rights movement, but connect it in a powerful way to our contemporary moment, and also inspire young people to think about what that next chapter looks like and what their role is. In other words, inviting them to become Melba Patella Beals for this moment, but all through a conversation about this history. What are you talking about, Yohuru? John Lewis is born in 1940 in a world in which segregation is the norm. If we think about the world in 1940, what did the world look like before you had, as Martin Luther King says in 1963, African nations moving with and Latin American nations moving with jet-like speed toward independence, right? Before Kwame Nkrumah, before Latin American revolutions, before any of that, right? Think about what the landscape looks like in the United States in 1940. John Lewis is born the year before the March on Washington movement, which A. Philip Randolph will lead, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And we think about the demands of the the March on Washington movement. John Lewis will then, in 1963, be the youngest speaker at the fruition of that March on Washington movement when he joins A. Philip Randolph and other senior leaders as part of the demonstrators at the March on Washington. I love this. If we think about on anyone's timeline, what's the one year that we would associate with their kind of most visible moment of importance or significance? There's so many for John Lewis, but for me, it's the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 1965. And that we associate with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. John Lewis dies in 2020 in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement. John Lewis dies in 2020 in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. John Lewis dies in 2020 where there is all kinds of conversation about voter suppression. As I mentioned to you last week, it's John Lewis who comes out and reminds the Roberts Court after Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, please don't forget to walk in our shoes. Don't forget those who stood in those immovable lines. It's John Lewis who's giving the nation a history lesson. But I want to point out that what's so powerful about this is that 2020 John Lewis didn't lose hope. It's a very hopeful and powerful message that bottoms on this idea that agency is something that young people have. Why are you talking about this today and how is it tied? Well, look, I can't tell you that there's no way that I can't talk about the shadow of our contemporary moment and do this lecture with you today, as we're now having a national conversation about anti-Asian hate. There's a very disturbing political cartoon from 1880 that many of you have probably seen before, maybe you never taught. But what's so powerful to me about this cartoon, as you can see here, is it shows a mob of people basically hoisting up this Chinese immigrant by his hair. Over their heads is the banner that says, "No Chinese need apply by order of the Citizens League of America, Pat Muldoon." And it depicts, and I'm going to read this description to you, cartoon centering the intolerance which disguised itself as patriotism and anti-Chinese sentiments. Cartoon depicts Irish, German, Italian, and African-American citizens lynching a Chinese man circa 1880. On some level, I have issues with this. And in some ways, I think it's a powerful teaching tool in terms of what we've seen in the aftermath of the spot killings in Atlanta and the national conversation about Asian hate. And if I want to take that on, I want to talk about nativism. I want to talk about anti-foreign sentiment in the United States, but I want to tie that to Black civil rights, and I want to tie that to coalition building, and I want to tie that to John Lewis. And I'm going to do that by making the case, as Thomas Nast did eloquently, in the cartoons that are produced in that period. Think about this image from August of 1865, Why Not This Man? And then Thomas Nast returns to that in 1871 to talk about efforts at Chinese exclusion and the same concept of Lady Liberty speaking in defense of not only the freedmen, but also in defense of the immigrant. If we read through what's there, it's really powerful because it talks about the same challenges that both of these communities would have faced: discrimination because of race, discrimination because of economic competition, a denial of basic civil rights. The origins of American slavery, we know, and we teach, and we should obviously highlight in conversations about civil rights, but there's a way to connect that in our conversation about nativism as well to be really powerful. And I want to do that in a way that then privileges the promise of Reconstruction, which is much broader, because I'm going to say this to you early and I'm going to say it often today, and that's this. One of the great things about thinking about the John Lewis Doctrine as a teaching tool is it allows us to connect the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s organically with 3 civil wars, 2 reconstructions, and perhaps what may be the origins right now of a 3rd reconstruction. The first Civil War we know, it's fought between 1861 and 1865. We tend to measure it in terms of its major battles. We talk about it in terms of Bull Run and Antietam and Gettysburg. We talk about the major legislation that came out of that first Civil War: a 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, a Force Act of 1870, a Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a Civil Rights Act of 1866, and a Civil Rights Act of 1875. Arnold Taylor at Howard University says we can also talk about a second Civil War in the 1950s and 1960s. And those meanings that we can do, the reason we can do that are both substantive and cosmetic. We can teach the second Civil War in terms of its major battles. Think about it, we talk about it this way. Montgomery, the first major battle of the second Civil War, or Brown. Albany, Georgia, Birmingham, Selma. We can think about the major armies that fought that war: the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the major generals, Daisy Bates in Little Rock, Arkansas, or Arkansas, the state president, Ella Baker and her influence over the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Bayard Rustin. But more importantly, Taylor says we can think about the outcomes of that second Civil War: Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, here we are in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Here we are in this tremendous moment of reckoning. Here we are in the midst of the Biden administration coming out and making all these statements in the very beginning of January about dealing with these issues. And the question is, as Peniel Joseph has argued in his recent biography of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, The Sword and the Shield, is America due for a 3rd Reconstruction? What would that look like? I go back to Thomas Nast and this incredible cartoon from 1869, Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving. Who's around the table? And what is it, or what dream is it that they aspire to? The images on the wall are of Washington and of Lincoln, but there are women around that table, and men and children of all races and all categories. And what's the centerpiece of the meal? Universal suffrage, self-government. What do you think is powerful about that? And of course, it reads, "Come one, come all," is that at the core, what we're talking about is the civil theology that has undergirded efforts to ensure absolute equality before the law for African Americans, and which undermines the whole impetus or gravitas around nativism. I think about this in a way that Abraham Lincoln talked about it in 1858 in a speech that he delivers on the 4th of July, in which Lincoln argues that immigrants can feel a sense of the connection to the Declaration of Independence, even though they weren't born here, because they're attracted to the larger ideals, the values, what America represents. Here's what Lincoln says in that context: "We have, besides these men descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps Half are people who are not descendants at all of these men. There are men who come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled, finding themselves are equals in all things. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back to the glorious epic and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they feel that moral sentiment taught in the day evidences their relation to those men. That is the father of all moral principle in them. And they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of that blood and flesh of that flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. That is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic, liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. Yes, problematic. Yes, gendered. Yes, we have to make it contemporary. But powerful in that, I'll say this to you, Lincoln's in conversation with John Lewis. And they're in the process of imagining what America could be. We think about this in terms of in practical terms, in terms of teaching the preamble. Let's look at the language of the preamble itself. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but when we look at it in that context, it's this incredible opportunity, as we mentioned, to not only pair that with the core democratic values articulated by the National Council for the Social Studies, but to look at that in the context of practice versus aspiration. I want to be clear. If you ask anybody what American core democratic values are, you're not going to find them in Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution. You're going to find them in the aspirational language of the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution. Not what we are, what we aspire to be. And white supremacy, in some sense, when we think about it, and when we talk about it, the evil and the cancer of white supremacy, exists because it denies the very foundation of that civil theology. I want to say this and show this to you in this way, because I want to link this again to immigration and where we are. If we think about the cartoon that I showed you earlier, right? Every dog has his day, no distinction of color. And I want to, or maybe I didn't get there yet, I apologize. We think about this cartoon that I didn't show you yet. Every dog has his day, no distinction of color, from 1879. It's a powerful teaching tool, and this is how I would be talking about our contemporary moment. In the cartoon, you see a Native American or indigenous person talking to a Chinese immigrant who's reading the list of Chinese exclusion laws. And you can read through this, you know these: the Chinese must go, the Chinese problem, prohibit Chinese immigration, all further immigration to the state of Chinese and all other persons illegal to the US under the naturalization law should hereby be prohibited. Laws providing for their banishment, foreigners not wanted, patented by the Irish. Lager by our government must have social fritz. Know nothing is in the past. Down with the Irish, down with the Dutch. You know what I'm saying here is that Thomas Nast has given us a wonderful teaching tool to talk about earlier efforts at anti-nativism. But then it's the wonderful caption, which you can't see, in which it reads, red gentleman to yellow gentleman. Pale face, afraid you'll crowd him out the way he did me. Which I think is really powerful. But then look way back and you see an African-American gentleman sitting in the background, and over his head is written the words, my day is a-coming. Now look, we teach this period, so we all know that it wasn't coming, it was there. We know about the violence and intimidation, the political chicanery, all the things that were happening in the South. But remember, this cartoon is produced only 2 years after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, only 2 years after the official end of Reconstruction. So to people in that moment, to someone like Thomas Nast, it may have still appeared that the promise or hope for African Americans was there, and yet he's declaring here in 1879, my day for that type of exclusion is coming. Fast forward to 1896, fast forward to Plessy versus Ferguson, and that day has come. This is fascinating, Yohuru, but I still don't see what this has to do with the price of tea in China. Follow me here. If we think about that second wave of immigration and the people who come, look at the responses to them. and how we can map them and tie them in some substantive way to our conversation about civil rights, right? Not the civil rights movement, but civil rights. And we should be able to do both. Between 1881 and 1930, 27 million immigrants come to the United States. What's the response to them? The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, 1907, the Alien Lands Act, 1911 and 1913 in California. And if we think about the response in other ways, it is also showing up the hypocrisy of the civil theology when we don't live up to that value system. I'll give a good example. Here's a great political cartoon from 1912 by L.M. Glackens, which was published in Puck magazine. Shows Uncle Sam holding a paper protesting against Russian exclusion of Jewish Americans from Russia. And then him being surprised by the skeleton in his own closet, which is the skeleton of Chinese exclusion. I love this because, again, it's a wonderful way to think about the parallels in these conversations about nativism and how it manifests itself and how color after 1881 becomes a big part of this, how race becomes a big part of this. I also think it's important that we ask questions about who's impacted by this. And there's some interesting ways to think about this in a larger context. I love Segregation Signs, for example, that problematize the issue of civil rights, because I want my students to appreciate Plessy versus Ferguson and its impact on the African-American community. I need my students to understand that Black folks are ground zero in this debate, that the reality is that the brutality of that system is exerted with its full weight on the African-American community. But I also need them to know, and I'm going to show you one of the ways that I teach this that used to freak my colleagues out, that we do this is often by not talking about the African-American story because they think they know that story. And for those students who aren't African-American, they have no connection to it. And so they can't make that Lewis connection of this is relevant to me because. So I want to show you how I do that. I want to play this game very quickly with you. One of the things that I have here is this skin lightener advertisement. One of the reasons that Madam C.J. Walker becomes one of the biggest millionaires isn't because she was selling skin lighteners and hair straighteners to 12% of the population of the United States. She becomes that because lightening one's skin and straightening one's hair became associated with the propertiness of whiteness that scholars such as Ian Haney Lopez talk about in books like White by Law. The reality is that that whole industry of trying to trade out of one's race that becomes prominent in this period becomes prominent not just for African Americans, but all persons who are significantly quote unquote colored enough for those signs, which you all know because you teach this, don't say Black and white. Those signs say white and colored. And colored is a very broad designation and that's why in your document packet, I gave you those state laws on race and color, which most of my students are amazed when they read Georgia and they see that the word Negro includes mulatto, mestizo, or any person with any Mongolian, Chinese, or Asiatic. And my students go, I had no idea. Look, I don't want to lose you here, but I want to play this game with you because it gives us the opportunity then to talk about lynching against African Americans by talking about the lynching of 11 Italians in 1891, March 15th, 1891. Where are you going with this one, Doc? Going here. I may be a little bit uncomfortable to talk about Black Lives Matter in my classroom, but I'm going to teach by proximity with regard to this. So I talk about this as a manifestation of anti-Italian hate in the United States in the aftermath of this period of massive immigration to the US. But this is a great political cartoon because it shows the Italian ambassador bringing the case of these Italians who've been murdered before Uncle Sam and asking the question. And fundamentally, what the Italian embassy wants to know is why the lives of its citizens have been slaughtered. I'm going to say this in a way that will make sense to you. I don't know if I necessarily teach it this way, but what the Italian ambassador was saying by default is the lives of those men mattered and we need to have justice for them. And we need to understand what happened in this community by virtue of the fact that they were killed without due process and lynched through extra-legal violence. What he was saying by default is that their lives mattered. In the same way that Marcus Garvey in the 1920s will, in many of his speeches, ask the question, I'm quoting Garvey, do they lynch Englishmen? Do they lynch Frenchmen? No, because those nations have great governments, powerful governments, willing to spend every dime in the national treasury and spill the last drop of blood to protect the rights of their citizens abroad, end quote. Think about this. What I think is interesting about that then is, and this is what used to freak my colleagues out, I stopped teaching Plessy versus Ferguson 4 or 5 years into my teaching career, and people are like, what are you doing? It's like, oh, I teach it. I just don't start there. Where do you start? I start with this case, Gonglum versus Rice, 1927. Well, why do you start with this case? Anybody teach this case? Raise your hand if you do. Holler at me if you do. One of my favorite cases of all time, so I'm going to tell it to you very quickly. 1927, 1924, Rosedale Consolidated School. There's a Asian American family, a Chinese family named the Lums, who are living in Mississippi, and their children are enrolled in the local school. Martha, their oldest, is an exceptional student by all metrics, does very well in school. She gets through middle school, no problem, and it's time to go to high school, and she goes and arrives at Rosedale Consolidated School for the first day of class. When she arrives, she gets through first period, no problem, second period, no problem, third period, no problem. But in fourth period, her teacher approaches her and says, Miss Lum, I've received a note from the principal. You see the principal at noon. And so Martha walks down to the principal's office, and she can't figure out what she could possibly have done. And the principal says, Miss Lum, and she says, yes, sir. Miss Lum, gather your things, you're going home. I'm going home, sir? Yes, Miss Lum, gather your things, you're going home. Sir, what have I done? Never you mind, Miss Lum, gather your things. But sir, my parents, what will I tell my parents? What have I done, sir? I'll apologize, make amends, what have I done? Never you mind, Miss Lum, if your parents have questions, have them see me in the morning. But for now, gather your things and go. And so Martha does. And her parents own a grocery. And so she does that long wait that kids like myself who are very bad know very well, where you're waiting for your parents to get home to tell them the bad news, but recognize that her parents have already heard because it's a small community and they know Martha has been dismissed. And when they arrive that night, they are furious. Her father starts him first. What have you done to disgrace this family? Her mother, Martha, simply tell us what you've done and we'll make amends to the principal. I've done nothing, mother. So the next day, Gong Lum and his wife go down to the school to speak with the principal. And Gong Lum demands of the principal, why was my daughter dismissed? And the principal sits back in his chair and responds, because Mr. Lum, in the great state of Mississippi, we have laws governing the schools. We have laws for the whites, schools for the whites, and schools for the colored. And in the great state of Mississippi, your child is colored. The Lums sue all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The case is heard and decided by the only person to serve both as President of the United States and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, William Howard Taft. And Taft, on behalf of the majority, states that this question has already been well decided by this court, that it falls within the logical exercise of the police powers of states to determine within their borders who fits the classification and designation of certain races. And so no satisfaction for you, Martha Lum. And so the question is, how is this possible? Because of what happens in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, in that infamous case in which the Supreme Court determines, save one dissenting vote, John Marshall Harlan, that's separate but equal. I think it's interesting. I'm the only one. Anyway, what's powerful about the Lum case for me, and what's powerful about teaching it in this way, is that in moments like the moment we're experiencing now, it helps young people to understand, I hope in a really powerful way, that conversations about civil rights and social justice have always been intricately tied, intimately tied. We do this when we talk about the civil rights movement and the women's movement. We do this when we talk about the connection between Native Americans and African Americans, the founding of a school like Howard University, for example, which was supposed to be for the education of the freedmen and for Native Americans. So we want to understand that in that context, but at the same time, we want to appreciate that what this does is that when we have contemporary moments like the moment we're in now, help young people to appreciate that connection. And that again, we're talking about teaching by proxy and commenting by proximity, This is not a new phenomena. In fact, it's a phenomena that should be a part of the way that we're presenting this as a challenge to democratic process and democratic exercise in the US. Follow me here, because I'm going to leave Martha alone for just a moment, but I'm going to come back to her. And I want to go to John Lewis again in the March on Washington. I want us to think about the March on Washington movement from 1941, the year after John Lewis is born. And what are A. Philip Randolph and his colleagues asking for? The Negro citizen, if you believe in, he's using Roosevelt's 4 freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, justice and equality and democracy for all Americans. He's articulating a universal vision of democracy, of equality, of justice that pivots on the words of a president, but at the same time address the fear and terror that African Americans, that people of color felt in the United States in a very tangible way in that moment. And he says, and if you're willing to fight, sacrifice, and pay for these rights, then support our March on Washington movement. It's a different way to talk about the March on Washington movement that ties it, I think, again, in a very tangible way to these broader questions about reimagining or revisioning democracy. I want to go one step further with you. 1942, here is A. Philip Randolph making the more extended case for what this movement is going to be about. And he begins by saying outright, what is it? It's a Negro mass movement to get the full benefits of this democracy. Tells who the leader is. It demonstrates what the leader has done. It asks what needs to be done. It invites people to reflect on what they can do. And in a lot of ways, what it maps for young people is this process when we talk about civics education of literally going through the process of the scientific method to arrive at how one can take action in a very organic way. The March on Washington movement demonstrates for young people who are trying to say, how do I take action? If I'm inspired by John Lewis, what does that look like? When John Lewis says study the past and the answers worked out long ago can be a window into what you can do in your contemporary moment to promote justice and equality, I don't need to sit there and give my students a bunch of things for them to go out and do. I can say, let's take a look at the March on Washington movement from 1942. A. Philip Randolph is a labor leader. A. Philip Randolph has the unenviable task of trying to inspire a large number of people to join this mass movement, to march on Washington in the midst of what was a very popular war, in the midst of a bombing of Pearl Harbor, which galvanized people to be outliers, for people to point at them and be derisive and say, how dare you go against this? And to make the case that that was a moment for them to advocate for freedom from fear, freedom from want, for full equality, and take full advantage of that. What's the process by which they did that? What are the questions he asked? What are the questions they asked? What did they determine needed to be done? And ultimately, how did they act? Look, I don't want to lose you here, but I think what's powerful about this, and another way of looking at this, and you've heard people talk about this in the last year, is sussing out the difference between movements and moments. And movements are simply, when we think about them, made up of many different moments. And isolating one or two moments for the purpose of teaching about the overall movement sometimes can be a very effective way to get students to make those connections over time we ultimately want them to be able to make in order to understand how the past influences their contemporary moment and how it should inspire them to think about how they can act. Give you a good example of this by talking about Ralph Ellison and the Invisible Man from 1952, because I want to say to all my social studies history educators that sometimes we don't take full advantage of our ability to use literature or interdisciplinary units that allow us to allow students to grapple with these issues in multiple ways. I didn't talk about Invisible Man last week, did I? Good, okay. So let's do this together very quickly. I did it with politics. I want to do it with literature. So here's Ralph Ellison in 1952. And I want to call this, instead of and I want to use this to teach Black Lives Matter, right? But I don't want to talk about Black Lives Matter directly. I just want students to understand that, as I've demonstrated, this whole question of whose life matters, of life, of we the people, and when a person's, it's got a long history and it manifests itself in different ways. So why am I going to use Ellison? Well, if you ever look at Black Lives Matter t-shirts, they say stay woke. Where does that come from? Before you tell me that it comes from Get Out, I want to play this game with you. Read the opening to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Remember, it's a journey motif novel in which the main character is never named, in which some of the main characters in the movie, like Ross the Destroyer, are actually patterned on real historical figures like Marcus Garvey. And in that very beginning of the novel, the invisible man is surrounded by lights, and he gives this wonderful testimony that starts, I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. You know what I absolutely love about that is, I think about this in the context of talking about the image of George Floyd last summer, 2020. And when they approach me, they see only my surroundings, 38th in Chicago, themselves, my fear and coming up against this person, or figments of their imagination, what they imagine me to be. Think about the Atlanta shootings in this context too. And don't lose me here, because I don't have to ever talk about any of those things to make the point that Ellison is talking about what it feels like to be invisible in a society in which you are a citizen. And yet people respond to you not on the basis of, to borrow a term, the content of your character, but the color of your skin, or their perceptions about you, or your surroundings, or your. Watch where he goes next, because this is this is where stay woke comes from. I remember that I'm invisible, and I walk softly so as not to awake the sleeping ones. Sometimes it's best not to awaken them. There are few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers. This is a generation of young people, of activists who say, wake the sleepwalkers up. In fact, not only wake them up, stay woke. Like wake them up and make sure that we don't get to sleep. Now follow me here, because I want to be clear that, again, I'm not going to teach it this way, but I'm talking to you about it in this way, that part of that message is for them, for this generation, that sleepwalking produces the situation where you can have a Philando Castile, or you can have a Sandra Bland, or you can have a Raynette Turner, you can have a Tamir Rice, or you can have a insert name here, Michael Brown, or Sean Bell. I'm going back to New York in 2006, 50 shots, Amadou Diallo, 1999, 41 shots, a Bruce Springsteen song in celebration, a massive march on Central Park. No change. Because people sleptwalk through it. Look, it's great that Jordan Peele recognized that you could craft a bit of horror out of this. But what I appreciate is that Ralph Ellison is in conversation with John Lewis, is in conversation with Chief Justice Taft, is in conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, because these are all echoes of the past. When Ta-Nehisi Coates writes Between the World and Me, where is he taking that from? He's taking it from W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folks, 1903. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls his book Between the World and Me. Chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folks begins, between me and the other world. Ta-Nehisi Coates is having a 100-year conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois about the nature of the problem in 2019, 2018, and 1903. How does Du Bois define that problem? Between me and the other world. See, I don't have to talk about Coates. Coates opened the door for me to talk about Coates by talking about Du Bois in relation to The Souls of Black Folks, one of the most important books ever published in American scholarship, is a standard, a classic, right? Between me and the other world, there's an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, follow him here, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing. All nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? Ha ha. They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or I'm interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as they occasion. Excuse me. Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile or am interested or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. As to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. What's going on there? I know you all know, but I'm going to exercise presenter prerogative and tell you my interpretation of this, which I think is really powerful, because I submit to you that W.E.B. Du Bois is in conversation with Ralph Ellison. Again, and they're both in conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates. So I've got three voices, one from 1903, one from 1952, and one from 2018. And I'm like, I'm in heaven right now. And they're all saying that, what does it feel like to be a member of a society and yet at the same time have people respond to you? Because as Du Bois is laying out here, what are these three people saying to him? They're only seeing his surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. And what was Coates arguing in Between the World and Me? In our contemporary Black Lives Matter Stay Woke movement, people are only seeing the surroundings of the people that are killed, themselves, all lives matter, or figments of their imagination. I'm not trying to make us uncomfortable, and I apologize if anybody takes me as being political. I don't get to talk to educators much, but I think we are living in a moment where there's tremendous need for us to be bold in what we share, but to share so anchored in this type of context, so we can actually really get young people to think about the substance of those connections beyond the slogans. They're there, the connections are there. That's why I love what John Lewis did so much, because John Lewis gave me the opportunity to go in day one and say, there's a whole world to this discussion that you don't know yet. And we together as co-investigators are going to open some doors this semester, and we're going to interrogate what it means to be an American and what it hasn't meant. And I'm going to invite you in that process to think about all the great people, some luminaries and intellectual giants like W.E.B. Du Bois, some literary persona like Ralph Ellison and Zora Neale Hurston, some 13-year-old kids like Melba Patilla Beals. And they're going to answer this question about what it means to be a problem or how to change that. I love that because in a way, and again, very controversial, but I have to do this with you. I'm going to play this video for you, and it's Al Sharpton last year talking about George Floyd. I'm going to end on this slide, actually. I'm not a huge fan of Al Sharpton, but I'm going to say something about this particular segment because I think it ties all of these things together. And it's the way that he frames it, and there's a nice metaphor in there, and it'll connect the dots for us today. So let me play this very quickly. Oh, you guys can't hear that. I apologize.
Because
let me go back. Here we go.
George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks. Because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in, but you had your knee on our neck. We could run corporations and not hustle in the street, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks. But I'm more hopeful today than ever. Why? Well, let me go back. Reverend Jackson always taught me, stay on your text. Go back to my text, Ecclesiastes. There is a time and a season. And when I looked this time and saw marches where in some cases young whites outnumbered the blacks marching, I know that it's a different time and a different season. When I looked and saw people in Germany marching for George Floyd, it's a different time and a different season. When they went in front of the parliament in London, England, and said it's a different time and a different season, I come to tell you, America, this is the time of dealing with accountability in the criminal justice system. Joe?
What I'm going to say to you about that is, and I think I want to leave some time for conversation here, so I'm going to go out of this. What I want to say to you about that is this. No matter how you feel about Al Sharpton, what's powerful to me about the speech that he gave is that he's clearly in conversation with John Lewis, and he's clearly in conversation with all the other content that we talked about today. And his hopefulness is really around young people in this moment reimagining what democracy can be. It's actually a pretty remarkable, again, no matter how you feel about him, I'm saying you should play that in class, but it's one of those things where it's inviting young people to reflect on the Lewis Doctrine in a very concrete way. Ordinary people, individually and collectively, make history. And those individuals, individually and collectively, have to come to their decisions on how to act based on any number of phenomena. They can develop a sense of extraordinary vision by studying the past, by looking at past chapters and asking critical questions about the moment in which they enter that story, what's come before, and what they can imagine can be better after. They should be looking at this in the context of global, not just what happens in the United States, but a much broader frame, as John Lewis talked about. And then the interesting one, I think the most important one in some sense, is that while they're doing all of these things, they should still be and should still privilege participation to its fullest in the political process that we have by voting, because as he says, exercising the right to vote, but at the same time you can lose it, and so you have to be vigilant. It is, I think, this powerful way of getting young people to recognize the pertinence of history, the importance of civic education, and the investment that we all individually have to make in the society in which we inhabit. It doesn't in any way forestall us about talking about the ugly truth associated with white supremacy, about violence, about political chicanery, any of that. But it does invite us to do that in a much broader frame that puts us in the best position at any time to pivot and to be able to challenge, as we've just seen, and this has been a year for it, all these things that have come up. Preamble, John Lewis for next year might be a great way to think about an exciting co-investigation with young people into the evolving nature of American democracy and democratic practice. That's my presentation, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you so much, Yohuru. Let's open the floor to your thoughts and questions. Yohuru, shall we have people use their Zoom hands? What do you prefer? Yeah, okay, that sounds great. So go ahead and again, if you don't spend all your time like we do on Zoom, you can raise your hand clicking on the reactions icon down in your toolbar. Robert, I see your real hand. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm looking for the hand down there. I can't find it. I just wanted to ask if we could circle, like I thought it was unbelievable. You know, my notes, I've tried to get everything you were talking about in terms of, you know, 3 civil wars, a 3rd Reconstruction, right? So to me, that was like, that's so powerful to talk in those terms with kids, right? You know, and we've been talking here in our school for a while now about, do kids see themselves in the curriculum, right? So what better way to see, for kids to see themselves in the Civil War as to make what you said, make that connection to today, right? Bring the 1860s to the 2019, 2020. So, but my question was, I really wanted to ask, you know, in my notes from last week, you had talked about historical fingerprinting. And I was just wondering if you could circle back and just like give us a little bit about what historical fingerprinting is. Because I was really, you kind of piqued my interest last week with that. And I I've had it on my sticky notes and kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
I will do that for you. Let me just pull this up quickly. I got so wrapped up in our conversation last week, I forgot I promised to do fingerprinting. So I will actually demonstrate that for you, but it's going to take me a second to bring that slide up. While I bring that up, let me answer the question about Al Sharpton. I don't have a problem with Al Sharpton. I think Al Sharpton is polarizing for some people. And the problem in mentioning him in a presentation is some people will just check out on you because they don't like him. And I think that there's real value in what he said in that particular moment. And I teach people that are unpopular and with whom I disagree and I think in that moment, there's a lot to unpack and there's a lot of value for us as educators to be able to think about that if we're teaching a longue durée. I would not go into a classroom and play that though, without referencing the fact that he can be a polarizing figure for some. And he is incredibly polar, particularly in New Yorkers. I mean, there's a long history to Al Sharpton too. And I don't want to turn our webinar conversation into, Al Sharpton 101, but I think that I'm always cognizant of the fact that, and I'm very careful about this. I don't know what politics and what background my students come from, and I never want them to see anything that I'm doing as being special pleadings. I will not go so far as to do equal time because I don't think it's productive for me to be looking for other voices for the sake of other voices. I think it is fair to say the person or the lesson or the document I'm introducing today can be controversial in some circles because people feel differently about this individual. But remember, our litmus test is always to evaluate the words in the context of the history we're interrogating, not necessarily to focus solely on the individual in certain contexts. I hope that asked the question because it's a great question. And then let me do the fingerprinting very quickly. So historical fingerprinting is, I hope I have this up. Yes, I do, thank goodness. I'm gonna share this. Apologize everybody for taking 45 minutes, but that's what Yohuru does. Historical fingerprinting is a method of document instruction where what we do is we take 4 of the actual 7 characteristics that forensic scientists use in fingerprinting and we apply them to history. So I'll give you a good example of this. It's a great political cartoon from Kevin Tuma. And I ask my students, and I'll ask you, without looking at any of the text, when is this cartoon from? Don't read any of the text, don't use the text.
I would say I would have looked at it just quickly and said the peace symbol, the 1960s. Probably.
Genius. Who said that? I can't see you.
I did.
Thank you, genius. Anybody, any dissenters from the 1960s?
The 70s would have worked too, maybe.
Very good, very nice, brilliant. Anybody else?
I was
Really sure I buy the 60s because his pants are really far down.
Genius.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the shorts are short. The girls' shorts are short.
and his hair is short.
Nice call, Martina. Who said his hair is short? Who said that? I can't see.
Melissa.
Melissa, genius. Follow me here, my friends. Kevin Tuma, I love this cartoon because he's playing with different, the symbol, the peace symbol is a ubiquitous symbol of the 1960s, right? If you just looked at the anti-war protest, you immediately think 1960s, right? Anti-war, but then there are other things that mark this as different. Look at the sag and the pants, right? Which we know to be the Britney Spears midriff. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a play Hair, and the whole thing was grow your hair out, and hair, big afros and long hair were a symbol of protest. So ironically, Kevin Tuma is trying to play with these different decades because this whole cartoon is dependent on that historical comparison. And if you don't know that historical comparison, the whole meaning of the cartoon is lost. If we read the text together, it gives away what it's from. I'm a self-indulgent, spoiled wastrel who couldn't care less about world peace. In fact, I think violence is cool. But because I have an ex-hippie professor and I personally do not want to be drafted, I oppose this war. When is this cartoon from?
That could be today.
Genius. It's definitely Gulf 1. And the thing that's interesting about this is the language now gives us clue. Wastrel, which my students can study. When did that? That's not a thing anymore, right? Ex-hippie professor. So there are all kinds of clues here. But what Kevin Toome is trying to do is make a comparison between the generation of the 1960s that, in his estimation, based on what he says here, was opposed to the war in Vietnam out of a sense of principle, and young people in that moment, 1992, who were opposed to the war, not because they believe violence is wrong. In fact, they're in a world awash with violent movies, violent video games, violent everything, right? But because they don't want the inconvenience of being violent. Isn't this powerful?
Yeah.
But the thing is, students won't be able to make that connection because they don't have that longitudinal historical knowledge. So we have to give them an artificial toolkit to help them do that. So I asked them to literally look at, if we were fingerprinting a person, we'd be looking at all these things. In historical fingerprinting, we look at 4. Core. What's the main argument that Kevin Toome is trying to make? What's the point that he wants to get at? Secondly, crossover. How does that argument build on or relate to historical content that we may have covered or we may not have covered? So why the peace sign? Like you could radically change the meaning of this cartoon if you were change that peace sign to something else. So what's the crossover? Island. What about the cartoon or the document, the text marks it as unique? There's always going to be something about any document, any image that's going to mark it as unique. Give you a good example. The Declaration of Independence has been used across time by various groups to appeal for freedom and equality, but the reality is it's dripping with the language of the Enlightenment. You could almost mark it because of the language that Jefferson employs. And so that gives you that island. What's the island in this cartoon? It could be the SAG. I love that you guys went through all this just organically. Like, oh, the short hair, the Britney Spears midriff, the word wastrel. There are things in here that carbon date this cartoon. There are things in every document, every cartoon, every image that date it in ways that are powerful if we want to see if there's a historical comparison to be made. And then last but not least is bifurcation. Could they change the meaning of this cartoon, change the meaning of a text by updating, deleting, substituting words or images? Everybody follow me here? Let me give you another quick example, and I'm sorry for the long response to you, Robert. This is a great historical fingerprinting cartoon. I'm not going to do this one with you. I'm going to do this one very quickly. This one's from 1937, C.D. Batchelor, probably one of the most famous cartoons. You all probably use this. Shows a young man going up the stairs, and he's greeted by war. What's on the back of his jacket? What does it say?
Any European youth, I think.
Genius, good. And in the marquee, there's a thing that says Follies of 1936 starring Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin now playing. And it's war, and she's leading him up to the thing, furnished rooms, and the title of the cartoon, "Come on in, I'll treat you right. I used to know your dad."
I used to know your daddy, right?
Really powerful. Look, clearly he's making the case that Lord Grey made with regard to World War I, that a whole generation is marching blindly into war and is about to be slaughtered because they're looking at war that looks attractive. She got a great body, but look at her face. You guys follow me here? Sexist as heck, but that's the point that C.D. Batchelor is trying to make here. It's also powerful that if you think about it, it's any European youth. If we were to, so we know what marks this as unique. What's the island? The 1936, any European youth. How could we bifurcate this? Change that marquee to read a different date. Everybody follow me here? Change what's on the back of that jacket to read some other, could be any Bosnian youth, if you're gonna do the Bosnia-Herzegovina conflict. You can change any of that. What's the core argument? War is hell, and yet people are seduced into believing that war is, what's the crossover? It's clearly an appeal to what happened in World War I. So that's a very quick fingerprinting. And Robert, I'm gonna do one last one. Why do I like fingerprinting? Because I can put up graphs like this all day and it's not compelling to my students. I'd want them to be moved by the war dead, but if I can do that in conjunction with this cartoon, bam. Follow me, everybody? I apologize for doing this quickly. I'm gonna do one last one with you. That's gonna be a primary source. How many of you teach George Kennan, American Diplomacy? Melissa, I hope you'll love this. What I love about George Kennan is we all know that famous riff from American Diplomacy, one of my favorite, where George Kennan's talking about democracy. Democracy is peace-loving. It does not like to go to war. It's slow to rise to provocation. When it's once been provoked to the point where it must grasp the sword, it does not easily forgive its adversary for having produced the situation. The fact of the provocation then becomes itself the issue. What I love about this is whenever any historical figure starts playing with history or saying something always speaking in superlatives or in fair game for historical fingerprinting. So now I'm asking my co-investigators, is this true? Is democracy peace-loving? Are we slow to This is a sleeping giant argument we all know, but it's a great invitation for them. Watch where Kennan goes and watch where we wind up. Democracy fights in anger. It fights for the very reason it was forced to go to war. It fights to punish the power that was rash enough and hostile enough to provoke it. To teach that power a lesson it will not forget. To prevent such a thing from happening again. Such a war must be carried through to the bitter end. This is true enough. And if nations could afford to operate in the climate, I didn't change the slide, of individual ethics, it would be understandable and acceptable. But I sometimes wonder whether in these respects, a democracy is not uncomfortably similar to one of those prehistoric monsters with the body the size of this room and the brain the size of a pen. He lies there in his comfortable primeval mud and pays little attention to his environment. He's slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are being disturbed. But once he grasps this, he lays about himself with such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his native habitat. You wonder whether it would have not been wiser for him to have taken a little more interest in what was going on at an earlier date and seeing whether he could have prevented some of these situations from arising instead of proceeding from an undiscriminating indifference to a holy wrath equally undiscriminating. Why do I love this so much, and why do I call this historical fingerprinting? If I interrogate this with my students, we're testing them out. Let's just go through a couple of conflicts together. February 15th, 1898, remember the Maine, the hell with Spain. Our battleship was sunk in Havana Harbor. Not exactly. See, this is our narrative, and we love this narrative about the sleeping giant. Like, we love to tell our stories. But the fact of the matter is there's a longstanding conflict between Cuba and Spain going back to the Civil War, which we couldn't intervene in because we had just come off the Civil War. And we now know it was probably a mechanical failure that took down the Maine, but the yellow press came in, but that's our narrative. And Kennan's saying in 1956, we can't afford this narrative right now in dealing with anti-communism. Everybody follow me here?
Yep.
Crap. One more. May 7th, 1915. The Lusitania was sunk without, not exactly. No, the Kaiser was pretty clear. Don't come with none of your, Jefferson, Madison, benevolent neutrality crap up in here. If you sail your ships out on the high seas and we believe they have contraband, we'll sink them. The Lusitania wasn't the first. We know this, but that's the narrative. And Kennan is saying in that moment around American diplomacy, can't afford it. December 7th, the date that will live in infamy. People think I'm being political. I'm not, but George Bush. But whenever anybody is talking about history and making comparisons, they're fair game for a fingerprint. George Bush said, time is passing, yet Americans will remember September 11th. There'll be no forgetting. Respectfully, I would say we've already forgotten. And I would tell my students this a long time ago, not so much now. Because I remember all the people who complained after we changed the way that we got on airplanes. But remember, Kennan says that. He not only destroys his enemy, but largely wrecks his native habitat. The freedom that we knew before 9/11 was irrevocably changed in the aftermath of 9/11. Give you all a great example of this. I remember the good old days of going to the airport. My ex-wife would drop me off at Philadelphia Airport, and I would run through the airport 5 minutes before my flight like OJ in those old TWA commercials. Bad analogy. But anyway, remember the days when they would hold the gate for you? Remember the days when they'd be like, Mr. Williams is coming through, and you didn't have to put liquids in bins and all of that. You could some of the things that people carried on planes are quite remarkable. And I would always have my Diet Dr. Pepper in one hand and skirt through, and all of that changed post 9/11. You guys follow me here? What Kennan's saying is a teaching tool is powerful because he's given me an opportunity to talk about American foreign policy in the 20th century in a very organic way that situates it in the lived experience of my students. Last one, our enemies have made the mistake our enemies always make. They saw liberty and thought they saw weakness, and now they see defeat. I think if George Kennan could have a conversation with George W. Bush, this is what he would say, respectfully. Mr. President, they did not see liberty and see weakness. What they saw was a nation on caution. The United States is a fickle bird. You never know what the Americans flip the coin like Saddam Hussein did. Sometimes, is it Kosovo, or you never know what the Americans flip the coin the way Saddam did. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. Depends on their narrative and where they are. Like, I'm not saying that to make light of this, but I'm also saying that what did we just cover? We literally, in a very, very short not so short because I took up all. Somebody put Gulf of Tonkin. I love this group. It's like next level. What we did together is you insert any conflict there, and it's a great way to get students to think about what our narrative has been, what the reality is, and how we like to fashion stories to tell the story of America. The Minutemen, even back to the Colonial War. So, Robert, I took up everybody's time answering your question, but I hope you love me.
I'm sorry, but I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. 'Cause
Martina, you had your hand up, Martina. Do you want to jump in?
That was sort of by accident, but I did kind of want to ask if I could see the slide with the fingerprinting one more time. I wanted to take a snapshot, if possible.
Sure. Absolutely.
Because it was a nice summary. I have your book, so I could look it up, The Island Bifurcate, but it was a nice one pager.
Let me go
Thank
back
you.
there. No problem. Happy to do that.
Thank
Is that
you.
the- Yep.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
And I think we have time for one more question if somebody would like to come to the fore. Dan, jump in.
I think this is a bad last question, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. One thing that I was struck with just when I was listening was how much you were covering and how fluidly you were moving between past and present, between far past and less far past. As a history teacher, I often struggle with students who don't really think historically, right? They don't think about development over time. They actually leap to connections. They love connections, but those connections are just so fluid and become a big jumble. And so do you have techniques for dealing with that problem of allowing them to see development, not just connection, if that makes sense?
Great point, Daniel. No, it's an outstanding point. And, like Sam Weinberg and those, they do a lot with that. I model it because I've seen people go down the trap of trying to teach that substance. And what ends up happening is that then that takes away from, you need the fluidity to get them there, but then you've got to model the depth. And I realize that's not always a satisfying response, but if we were, and I think you all know this, if we were in class together, we'd be unpacking all the layers of this onion together. But I've got to keep them dialed in. And I can't do that if it ends up becoming, I want them to make the connections, but then I'm going to force them to go, that's the co-investigator model. Here's the connection, that's fine. What's the main point? What's the cartoon? Where's the island? How could we bifurcate this? So I'm always forcing them to go back and revisit until I feel like we've gotten that sufficient depth. And fingerprinting allows me to do that because just like with George Kennan, they can start throwing up 8 million examples on the board, but then we've got to unpack each one of those examples. And then I'm going to ask them for each one that we look at. And, why that document? Why that image? Why that use? Why that example? And, that gives us the opportunity to get that deeper level of investigation. I'm going to give you my email, Daniel, because we can talk more about it. I'm not giving you a good example of this, but for me, the most authentic way I could do it, because I tried it the other way where we did the document analysis for a week, and I watched some of the kids who had fire in their bellies, my 11th graders, die in that week because their brains were firing. And so I had to match them, but not let them off the hook for the depth that you're talking about. And that means literally, if they're going to throw something in, then if you want to bring that up, you got to fingerprint it. So you got to bring me, and then I'm going to interrogate it, and then we're going to talk about it as a class, and I might throw something else at you. And so we can play that game, but you're not going to get away from the depth. It's not just about telling me that's like this. It's got to be, what else? And I'll give you a good example of this very, very quickly. In the aftermath of when Barack Obama became president, right? Our kids may pick up a newspaper and it would read something like, Obamacare may very well prove to be Barack Obama's Waterloo. Love that, right? They don't know what the hell Waterloo is. So I have the teaching opportunity of Waterloo, and I've introduced this whole idea of Napoleon's last stance as a missed opportunity, or, but then they can't just come in and say, well, it's like Nixon's Waterloo, not good enough. Why? Why are you making that connection? Or I give them extra credit if they can come back and make that case in a way that's substantive about something they're reading in a contemporary context. So I'm not doing a good job of it now, but I'm putting my email in the text. Feel free to, we'll hang out, we'll have French fries, we'll talk shop.
Well, I actually think that was a pretty perfect last question, because I think that's what this kind of teaching is really all about. And you've given us just such a beautiful sort of framework and ways of thinking about these kinds of questions. And I'm kind of stunned, and I'm also just really grateful. And so with that, I am afraid that we need to close for the day. I wish that you could come back every week, Yohuru Williams, because this has been such a pleasure. And so I want to thank you for being with us during these 2 weeks. And I want to thank all of you teachers for being with us as well and helping to enrich the conversation.